All right, welcome to Why Is This Good, a podcast by the Naples Writers Workshop. I'm Christine, and I'm here with Rob and John.
Hey guys.
Hello.
And this week is my turn. I picked a story called The Lady Tigers by Nick White. I had never read this story before, but I read the first couple paragraphs, and before I finished, I was like, this is going to be a good one, so I'll use it. I'm going to read a section about halfway through that kind of gives the backstory to the scene that this starts with. The week after he had told his mom he liked boys, his dad confessed to inappropriate behavior with one of the Lady Tigers. Rusty was stunned. Not because it had happened, but because he had been around his dad and the Lady Tigers for years and hadn't suspected a thing. After he showed no talent for sports, Rusty was tasked with being his dad's lackey, going with him to all the games, keeping stats, pretending to care. His parents were worried about him, the way he did things like a girl, though that's not exactly how they put it. Curious, they called it. When Rusty turned 17, his dad insisted he try earning a commercial driver's license and add chauffeur to his list of duties for the Lady Tigers ball club. To his surprise, he passed both the written and driving portions of the test. So he spent his junior year carting the Lady Tigers around the state, all while his dad had been sparking with one of them right under his nose. Rusty had been distracted by his own secrets that year. His name was Robert, but everybody called him Sparse because he was so thin. He was black and wore glasses and had a tongue as red as a canary. When Sparse's parents found out about them, they sent him to live with an aunt in Memphis, and Rusty had been so depressed he confided in his mom, telling her everything. His mom said at first that she didn't believe in homosexuals. Rusty told her he was real enough all right, but they both knew what she meant. She suggested that they keep this between them. So when Rusty's parents had called him into the living room one evening for a conversation, he assumed he knew the reason. His mom had caved. His dad knew. But no, he was all wrong. In fact, he probably couldn't be more wrong. His mom did most of the talking, very factual. The details. His dad had done this, and now this was going to happen. Rusty recognized the words but couldn't comprehend the language. Which one? Rusty's dad wouldn't say at first, and when he finally told him, the name meant little to Rusty, because they were more pack than team, and more team than individual people. He never bothered to learn their names. Who? Rusty's dad said, the pitcher. Oh, he knew then. 00. What? His mom said. What did you say? It's not important. She grabbed her purse and stormed outside. They heard the car pull out of the driveway into the street. She'll be back, Rusty's dad said. Rusty had his doubts. Dad, right, so I'm gay. What? No. What? Yeah. You sure? Rusty nodded. His dad walked into the kitchen and poured himself 3 fingers of Crown Royal. The next morning, Rusty found his mom on the couch, dipping the ashes of her Virginia Slim into an empty can of Tab. Your father, she said. He's skedaddled. Okay, so that's the backstory, but like I said, the story starts in this scene where Rusty is still the driver for the Lady Tigers, and his dad's out of the picture by this point because the scandal is in the past. There's a new, younger coach that Rusty kind of has the hots for, and he's driving the team home from a game in a rainstorm, and there's a bus crash. And so this story is told like in the immediate aftermath of that crash and how the Lady Tigers like kind of help revive Rusty and take care of the coach. And it's him like thinking about this scandal in those terms. So it doesn't all happen in this like hindsight sort of way, but I thought this section kind of explained it. So like I said, I just like stumbled upon the story, but I liked how it just started with something really uncomfortable and with the characters having to reconcile that. But I wondered if you guys liked it.
Yeah, I really did. I thought it was really sensual. The setting was like, just felt like it was just a story. I mean, not to be like kind of reductive, but it was just a great setting for a story that's largely about sex or kind of what the maybe not illicit sex, but unusual in the setting in the Delta. And it just kind of had like a humid feeling throughout all of it. The way that Rusty's kind of hung up on the sky. I thought it was a great kind of launching point for kind of probably how he feels inside, just kind of sour is the great word he uses in the first sentence.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, there's some really beautiful natural descriptions, and it's cool when an author, a writer can describe the setting is just kind of mirroring how the person feels inside. I thought that was kind of like the cyclones and the tornadoes, and it's just all this tumultuous weather. And this poor Rusty, yeah, that's kind of his internal state.
Right, and you don't have to there doesn't have to be like a heavy-handed metaphor for you to get the tone and to realize that they're connected, right? Like when I read it, I wasn't thinking that she was doing something overt with that tactic. But it comes across. You're in this dark setting and then something bad happens and then he tells you that something worse happened a while ago. And then it just, it set up something really uncomfortable. So, right, Rob mentions how this starts with a description of the storm itself. And so that first line is, Rusty sat behind the wheel of the bus and watched the sky turn sour. And then the immediate next sentence is, a year ago, when his father had coached the Lady Tigers, he'd been expected to serve as the team's water boy in addition to his regular duties as their bus driver. But Coach Culpepper, bless him, had no such expectations. He told Rusty he could stay on board. After all, Rusty was a senior and probably had important tests to study for. He didn't. So it like mentions that, but then it immediately gets into the backstory. It's like, there's a storm. Here's the backstory. And then it like shifts to the storm again. It's like, it's there the whole time, but it's not, I don't know. I didn't think it was overdone.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things I really thought was cool about this was just the way in which it unfolds the information. Mm-hmm. You know, you read the flashback section, but the way it leads into the flashback is really interesting. The way it comes out of the flashback and just the way it goes back and forth with, this is what you need to know now as it's unfolding. It's really expertly done.
It's definitely one of those things too that we talk about a lot in our writers group, because some writers are so hung up about how much an author or a reader needs to know in the immediate story. Like when the story immediately starts, like some writers think, oh, I got to tell you all this and all this and all this. It's like, not yet, you don't. And this is not something you can necessarily teach, but when you see it, like you said, unfolded this way, kind of slowly and kind of methodically, or just, let me tell you this, what he's thinking right now, that's interesting enough to get you to the next paragraph. You'll learn a little more later. Then you realize that you can kind of take your time. And then it makes it so the actual story, the crux of the story, which is that his dad was messing around with a teenage player, that packs more of a wallop than saying in the first sentence, Rusty is a bus driver. His dad had a fling with a lady tiger. Now there's a bus crash. Like, how boring is that?
Yeah, the story does a great idea of keeping its disguise on for a while. Because you figure, okay, we're in like a closet high school story. And it's in a really cool setting, like a broke down bus. Cool. Like, I'm in for that. That sounds fun. But then to introduce, I may be mixing up the continuity, but then to kind of drop the bomb that Christine just explained, it gives the story, I don't know, it makes Rusty just this much more, he wasn't necessarily a sad character. I mean, I feel kind of ashamed being like, oh, the poor gay kid pining after it. Well, I mean, so what? I mean, that's life, right? But then to kind of drop, no, like, that's not, it's almost as if the author is challenging to say, the first issue isn't the issue at all. The second one is like, this is like when people really fuck up and you commit crimes. Like, the first, right. So I love when a story can kind of do that, but do it in such a way where you don't feel like you're being like monkeyed with. Right. It felt natural enough, and it felt like, well, and particularly because the Coach Culpepper is such a good kind of, you're kind of being led to like, oh, this guy is a little shady. He's a little handsy with the girls. He hits the girl in the ass with the water bucket thing in the first scene. And you're like, all right, I think I know where this is going, but no, you're gonna get like you're gonna get the absolute worst version of the guy beforehand who you find out is gone, which is really fun. It's fun to see kind of Culpepper could be the dad in training, so to speak. That could be the first, that could have been Rusty's dad however many years ago, where he's like the hot, cool young teacher, and then he starts getting with his students. So, really uncomfortable story, and you can't give a bigger compliment than that, when you feel kind of,
Yeah, if you feel weird but you still want to read, it's probably worth exploring.
I love that.
And yeah, you're right. It's not so simple a story that it's just about a guy pining after an adult who's straight.
Which I still, that story is always like interesting to me.
Right. But then he adds on, my dad did this terrible thing, and also, isn't it weird that I'm the minor that's pining after the adult? It just introduces like every angle of that.
And then the girls become kind of the aggressors after, and they're sort of scary, and you don't know what they're going to do to him. Right. I was nervous for him the whole story with the girls. I didn't trust them at all.
Yeah, because they have this lingering...
Because they're a pack.
Yeah, they're a pack. He describes them that way. Yeah. And they are wise to what his dad did. And they know that he must have known part of it. And why are you still a bus driver? And isn't this like skeezy?
Why do your eyes look like the babe? Like, there's a lot of cool, like, just icky stuff in here that's just so juicy. I love it. Yeah. I'd be curious how old Nick White is. It seems like a very young person. It seems like a very young person's story, and that's not disparaging at all. It has just a lot of kind of fervor in that, and I think a lot of young writers I think a lot of young talented writers, as they're getting going, they seem to just love to describe settings and stuff. And so I was imagining like this is like someone in college, or this is someone who's 20, 25, and it was fun to read it from I would really bet the farm that this was written as a really young person, and just you you get the idea that this is, if not an autobiographical story, then there just seems to be a lot of personal, this seems to be a very personal story one way or the other. There's a lot of insight here that I don't think you would get.
Yeah.
At least I wouldn't be able to produce.
Yeah, it seems authentic to the ages of the characters he's writing about. And yeah, like you said, knowing the details of some of these dynamics. I really liked the way that all of the softball players were described, though, because he did a good job, the writer did a good job of showing them both ways, showing them the way that Rusty described them as this like anonymous pack, but then also as individuals. And it's only after the crash when individuals are checking his pupils to see if he has a concussion and telling the other girls, like calling out commands, telling them what to do with the coach, that you even get their actual names.
Yeah.
I don't even know if
That's
it's names. I think you might describe them all physically, but they're distinct.
They become distinct. One girl
is like
earns a
the
name.
leader.
She has that
Dee, yeah.
that moment. And I really liked. I marked it.
He calls them by their numbers.
Yeah.
Number 16, number 45, and Dee Dee.
She says, or the narration says, something like a smirk fixed itself on number 12's face, and she told him to call her Dee Dee, which is describes that you can see what she's thinking in that moment.
Right.
And it also introduces her more fully as having a name, gives her a special place.
Because of the smile.
Because of the smile, yeah, the smirk, the fact that she told him to call her Dee Dee, especially in what its response to. So did you just run us off the road for fun or what? Number 45 asked. Or what, he told her. Something like a smirk fixed itself in number 12's face, and she told him to call her Dee Dee. She's like impressed with him in that moment.
Yeah, she's like, you're allowed to know my name now.
Yeah.
I know you don't know it.
Which is a really cool way to, this is where that show tell thing always comes in, is like, you're telling us that a smirk was on her face. You're telling us that she told her to call Dee Dee, but you're showing us her internal reaction to what's happened just now.
Right.
That she's impressed.
Right.
You don't have to say she was impressed by that. We know that just based on those things.
Right, because those are descriptors that Rusty is seeing.
Yes.
He's watching her smirk. He doesn't know what she's thinking, but he's watching her smirk, and then he hears her say this, and he draws the same conclusion that the reader's drawing.
Well, and because it's from his point of view, and he doesn't necessarily draw that conclusion.
Sure,
we
sure.
can draw that conclusion
Sure.
based on what he's seen. I don't know, that's is one of those lines that does a lot of things all in one quick sentence.
What were you going to say, Rob?
No, it's interesting that to watch a writer kind of deploy something new that late in the story. Like, you don't get a lot of facial descriptions in the story until then. And as a writer, you're kind of thinking, all right, where am I in the story, and how do I keep the energy up? And so I think that's a really great example, is what haven't I looked at yet? What haven't I told the reader yet? What haven't I showed them yet? And if they're anonymous, if it's an anonymous team, you make one of them kind of emerge from the pack like that. Yeah, that's really smart, because what do we, like 5-6 pages halfway through into the story at that point, and you're in a groove. But I think it's up to the writer to be like always trying to stay a few steps ahead of the reader in terms of what are they going to be looking for.
Yeah, what are they expecting?
Yeah, not necessarily just plot, but just in how, like, the sentence, just what's happening in the sentence, like what am I giving away? And yeah, the show and tell, I'd be curious if you would speak more on that, John, as far as, because the show and tell, I mean, everyone who's ever picked up a pen, that's all you hear about. Don't do this, don't do that. And I'm curious what you think as far as why that's a great example of how you can do it. I try not to say should when it comes to art at all, but how you can do it. Maybe at what point should you start? What point can you start thinking about when can I do a show and tell thing?
Yeah, I think the reason that this one stands out to me is because the advice that I like about show and tell is, I think I read it in John Gardner. He said the only time you have to worry about showing and not telling is when you're showing characters' emotions and emotional states. It's more vivid, because he was a proponent of vividness, the fictive dream that people are supposed to enter into when they read your stuff. And maintaining that fictive dream is for him the number one priority. So giving us sensory impressions is more important than interpreting those sensory impressions. So for him, the showing, interpreting it would be saying, okay, she had a smirk on her face. She told her name. That means she's impressed, right? So you're interpreting what we're supposed to take from that. Whereas showing us and allowing us to interpret it is usually what I think is meant by the show tell, is give us the information that we can use to then interpret what's going on. And like I said, it doesn't even have to be something the character is aware of, because we as readers can see it the way a character can. I think that's where show is the most important. As I mentioned in a previous podcast, I don't remember which one, about if you're walking 3 blocks away, you don't have to show us that it's 3 blocks away by bringing us along for every step along the way. You can just get there, tell us it was 3 blocks away, and then you move into showing us whatever is important. I think that's the thing, is what you want to highlight, and what's important is what you want to show us, because we need to feel it. Feeling it and experiencing it is the most important part of this.
It also seems like it might be dependent on what type of narrator we have. If it's a first-person narrator, I think you can get away with way more telling, because by telling, you're getting insight into the narrator.
Right.
Yes.
And
it's doing like double duty.
yeah, you're really doing exactly. I'm writing a first-person thing now, and show tell never really shows up on my radar, but I can feel at points where I kind of want to let the reins out with the narrator and just have him tell you exactly how he feels about what's going on. And I'm not so much interested as far as, is the reader with me? But it's like, if the narrator has that energy where you can tell
you can kind of get away with it.
Yeah, everything's kind of like levitating. You're like, okay, this is important because it's important to the narrator. And you can tell he or she's into it. So I think the first thing a writer should may want to think about with show and tell is who's telling the story.
Yes.
Is it a third person where it's, with a third-person narrative, it seems like the reader is way more, I don't want to say more important, but closer, if that makes more sense. It seems like with the first-person narrator can be really dominating, or domineering even, and which I love. I love a first-person narrator who's almost authoritarian. They're just like, this is my effing story. And it almost becomes half about the plot and half about what the person thinks about the plot. And so if you can get through show and tell through there, then it really starts getting interesting as far as, okay, if they're just telling me this, but why aren't they showing me it? And then there's kind of that double duty that Christine mentioned. That's really kind of one to think about.
I want to talk about more in doing a few episodes, another story, but when it's a first-person narrator, I think the occasion of speaking becomes part of the story, or can become part of the story.
Just the style of...
Like, I think of, well, who is this narrator and why are they speaking?
Yeah.
And you can get glimpses of that, but those are things that become shown, not necessarily told. Because if I'm telling you a story, I'm not going to say, like, here we are sitting in this room, let me tell you a story.
Yeah.
I'm just going to launch into it. And then as we're going, I pick things up. Like we talked about in the Raymond Carver episode where this is dialogue. So it's kind of like when, what was his name? The main guy, the surgeon who talked too much.
And in the conversation.
Yeah.
When we talk about
love. He was reacting to things that were happening in the room without the narrator saying so-and-so did something.
Right.
So it's the same way in a first-person narration. They might react to things that are going on as they're telling the story. It doesn't have to be that way, but it can be. And those kinds of things are things that get shown because it's showing their state of mind by the way they're telling the story. And what they focus on does the same thing.
Yeah, why they're choosing to focus on this is the double duty. I love that expression. It's great. Which isn't to take anything away from third person. Third person has its own thing going on. There's nothing like playing God to these people, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Which when I sit down to write a story, I don't really think, should I do this first person or third person? But it seems like there's just some, I'm not sure what it is. Maybe the type of story types of story seems to lend themselves to the first or third person.
It is interesting in this story. It's in the third person, but it feels like it's from
it does feel like
Rusty's point of view, right?
It's like third person close, don't they call it?
Third limited, something like that, or close, But if you were to ask me like 6 months from now, I'd probably say, was that in first person?
Right, because you know so much.
Yeah, you know him and his thoughts and the way he's reacting to everything. But then there's this moment in here where he's summarizing what the girls are saying.
Oh yeah, he's kind of like hearing them like fawn over the coach.
Yeah, and I am not. Here it is. No.
You can't edit this out. They have to listen to all of it. The page flipping and the dead sound.
Yeah, here it is. Okay. So it's from his point of view, but he says
Rusty's point of view.
Rusty's point of view, and but he's reporting what they're saying, right? His quote. No, I'm sorry. Before that, she suggests another slap to rouse, and number 8 disagreed. Claimed she'd seen something on 2020 about how violent people got if you woke them up from being knocked out. That's sleepwalkers, dummy. Number 45 said, which is a direct quote. Before asking number 12, if this is not a direct quote, this is a reported speech, right? If she thought it was all right if she got up off the sissy. My ass, she said, is falling asleep. And that's a direct quote. So the reported quote, if she got up off the sissy, is using probably the word she used, sissy, but he is not reinterpreting as if she got up off of him.
Yeah,
he's reporting it with the same word, which is, it is not a break of POV. It's not like you're breaking a rule or something. But to me, that feels like he's getting into her head more than his own. That makes sense. Does that make sense?
As Rusty?
Rusty
or as the narrator?
is thinking thinking of himself the way she's thinking of him.
Oh, sure.
By talking about himself with that word.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And that's one of the, like, this is third person, so you can do that a little bit more with more facility. And you can do it with first person too, but I think it's something that happens in third person maybe more than first person.
Him having a concussion, I think, is critical for that too. I think you
That's
can really
right.
get away with stuff if someone's if someone's got their noggin knocked around.
That's right.
We were talking earlier about the way that the writer distinguished between the players by calling them by their numbers, but then referring to them like at the beginning and at the very end when they're like stomping off to find help as that pack of like girls wielding baseball bats. It reminded me of the Girls at Play story by Celeste Ng, because we talked about how that was told in this like first person group point of view and how it was so cool that the narrator in that story was a pack, that they didn't distinguish themselves. I just thought that was an interesting dynamic. It's a really cool way to characterize a group of people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And to not see them as individuals, but for them to almost be more exciting on the page than if they were individuals. Because like Rob said, he got impressions from the fact that they were this intimidating bunch or they had power in a group, especially when it's the coach and the driver that are incapacitated.
I think as you begin to read, you're not necessarily, you can't follow number 45, number 12, like who's who.
It's too many.
But you learn to eventually, but it lends itself to that group thing, like you're saying. Whereas if it were names, even though they might be all thrown at you at once and it takes a moment to really catch on, they're still distinguished in that way.
Right.
Whereas numbers are more indistinguishable.
It just added to this menacing feeling of the setting and the backstory. It made them a force instead of individuals. It's just something to think about. I don't know that I would think to describe a group that way, to just add that other level. Well, what would you guys copy from this, or what would be a good takeaway, do you think?
My takeaway was the thing I mentioned in the beginning was just the way that information unfolds here, the way that the flashback is led up to. And I read this a couple of times. So there's, like Rob laid out, or well, like you guys laid out in the beginning, the way that first paragraph unfolds, it kind of brings us into the current scene, but suggests a past. But we're really ensconced in that present moment.
Right.
Until we hit the flashback. But the moment that we hit the flashback is really interesting because it comes right after the crash, right? A diagonal crack slicing from bottom left to top right of the windshield was the only evidence it left behind it of itself. After it ricocheted off, Rusty lost control and sent them careering off the road. And then the part you read. The week after he had told his mom he liked boys, his dad confessed to inappropriate behavior. So it's like a break in the current action. It kind of mimics that. We just crashed, everything's confused, and we're going to step back and talk and like kind of bring ourselves in. It actually reminded me there's a moment in my novel where...
Oh, look at him plugging his novel.
The one I'm writing currently that will never be published, so don't
never
worry
mind.
about looking for it. No, but the character, I forget the exact moment because I was only thinking about this in hindsight and didn't look it up, but he's doing something and something is about to happen or has just happened, and suddenly I step back and say the wind, it was almost winter and the wind was cold or something like that. And I remember always looking at that passage and thinking, why did I do that? Why did I
Was it intentional?
break into that?
Yeah.
Should I revise it? Should I change it? Nobody has ever commented on it. Nobody says, this was really breaking the tension here, so I have not changed it. But this made me think of that because it kind of does something similar where we're really tense in this crash and then, okay, we're going to take a breath and go to the flashback.
Right.
And the flashback leads to basically what you could think of as another crash.
Right.
The next morning, Rusty found his mom on the couch.
And his dad's gone.
Yeah. Your father, he skedaddled. Where to? She didn't know. Or if she did, she wasn't telling. Boom, it's another crash, and then we're back to the moment. His glasses have been knocked off, his shirt torn, which could be a reaction to either one of those two crashes, right? He's just disoriented by both of them. So I think that's just so as a takeaway, that gives me something to think about is the way in which I might insert a flashback or information of some kind or something that needs to be temporarily out of order. How to insert that is kind of give it that emotional resonance.
That reminds me of the one piece of advice that I took away from that Sanibel Writers Conference that I went to a couple years ago, and it was specifically for novels, but it works with short stories, and it was that action, background, conflict development, so ABCD. And what people always misunderstood when I would try to explain that was that you don't start with the core action of the story. So in this case, you start with a crash, which is not the point of the story. The point of the story is his reaction to the girls at the end and how he feels about it in the context of this scandal in the past. But what the writer does is hook you with action. So he tells you all about the crash. And then by then you're ready to pause and listen to the backstory. And the backstory is the background, and the development is the fact that you need the background to understand the current action to appreciate the ending.
And it comes back later. Near the end,
right.
They're talking about the situation. Like he's getting their point of view on it. Like, I used to drive by y'all's house after I found out this was number 8. She looked at her lap. I used to think about driving my car into his bedroom. And then the couple more exchanges. Then he says, I promise, Rusty was saying. He saw his mom dipping ashes in the soda can. She was telling him they'd be better off with his dad gone. It never happened, she'd said, and I refuse to speak on it anymore. And that is right back into that flashback. He's kind of pulled us in just by the topic. And then this flashback ends with, that's the flashback there. Then number 45 spoke up. What I can't understand is why you kept driving us. And we get to another point where Dee Dee reached toward him and he violently jerked back. She was only placing a sweat rag against his nose. Here, he said, you're bleeding again. This is after he's just had a really intense emotional response to his memory. And this is almost like another crash. Because he steps back. We're out of the immediate scene again after that. We get to the Lady Tigers stuck to their plan. As soon as the weather cleared, some 2 hours after the wreck, they were trailing down the interstate towards the spaceway. So that moment where he breaks away from the current action again mirrors the same way he did in those other previous, which I'm calling a crash here just because the first episode of it was a crash, but it's like it reaches a climax and then we step back, and we reach the climax and we step back. So it's really, all the parallels are very interesting. And we can learn a lot from as far as our own stuff.
Yeah, it's like the kind of idea I was having was have the story like be as much about itself as it can. It seems like the story's always kind of commenting, not necessarily directly commenting on itself, but it's looking for new ways to represent itself. It's like the multiple crashes is such a beautiful idea. And it's like, this kind of leads to what I'm interested in with the story is how do you establish a character ASAP? How do I make you know who this character is in like, I don't know, the first paragraph that gives you like an 80% sense of who he is, and the 20% you want to find out what she's up to and why she's doing it. And that's like I think that's the most important for me, period, in like any storytelling form is who's the person? Like who's the vehicle of it? And then you just try to make it, I love that idea of just kind of like the story's not necessarily unfolding, but it's kind of always kind of just going back on itself. It's like something going down a drain, like in infinity. It's always like, no, I'm about this. Because if you think about it, the way kind of like your thoughts work, you're always, if you're thinking about kind of like your own identity, and it's always just, it really has a really circular feel to it. Like I'm getting up, like just kind of the way our days are arranged. You're doing this thing again and again, and you're picking up new information and you're subtracting it, but it's always kind of floating around the same core, the same drain. And if you can establish that immediately, I think people pick that up as an intuition that this is who this person is. And they're kind of, even, I know storytelling, you have the arc, traditionally, there's a conflict, there's a resolution, but I love the idea of that within that there's no, like, you're always kind of making the same mistake. And yeah, there may be a resolution and you may have learned something, but there's no guarantee that the next short story about these same people, the guy's going to make the same mistake again. So I think if you're always kind of intimating that, particularly in short stories, because they have such a day in the life feel, that there's a resolution, but I love that idea of just being like, this is going to happen again and again and again. So yeah, that's kind of an abstract thing to introduce in a character, but I think you can instill the sense into it just by showing someone's behavior. And you kind of our behavior is so repetitive. Just kind of the way we act every day is the same every day. And so from scene to scene, people are going to carry like the same thing, and you're going to make this, because within those crashes, he's always the same person. So to see him kind of not get anywhere is really satisfying in a weird way.
Yeah, we didn't really talk about the ending in the story yet, but I didn't find it particularly satisfying, and it didn't really stick out to me. It was just a comment that Rusty kind of has to himself as he's watching the girls, like I said, walk toward like a gas station to find help. And he says something about wanting to be able to like hold them in his hand the way he can, like on the horizon line right now with that like weird depth of field trick that you can do. And all he's really saying is he, wishes he could protect them into the future. nature, but it didn't feel like an epiphany moment. And I think it goes to Rob's point that if you establish a strong enough character, the story will be satisfying as a whole, not because it reaches a resolution, but because it's like explored itself.
That's a great way to put it.
It's like a theme. Like there's a theme here. Yeah, and I love the description of it circulating the drain, because that's how stories like that feel. Stories that are trying to figure themselves out. I find that too in a lot of like real first person stories where people are writing nonfiction and they're exploring an idea. And I love that feeling where it's like the author is basically telling the reader, like, I'm trying to figure this out too. I'll be quick with mine. Go ahead.
There was one little thing. He did say he regretted not learning all their names. I think that's a good part. Very small shift in his character. And then a couple of paragraphs before the ending, he said, when Rusty got home tonight after being checked out by the hospital, he wouldn't is an interesting, we've been in 5 minutes talking about that, but I won't. He wouldn't begin with the wreck. He would cut to the quick, the baby. Why didn't anyone tell me? He would ask his mom. He tried imagining her answer, but none came. So there's a suggestion that something has changed here, but we're not going to see what that change
we don't get to see it. We don't get to leave the actual bus crash.
Yeah.
We just watch them go to get help. We assume that they're all okay. And then, Rusty's going to go on to have to deal with this new information. But we don't get the satisfying result of like 20 years from now what Rusty thinks or what happens to the baby.
Yeah.
Yeah. My takeaway would just be quick, and I think I've said it before in other stories that we've read, but I just love when I read a story that's uncomfortable, because I feel like I don't usually go for the uncomfortable topics. And look how well this turns out.
Yeah.
They're so satisfying.
Wasn't that the takeaway?
Yeah, I definitely used it before, which sounds so stupid, but I realize that I like these kind of weird stories. They're a lot more fun to read. All right, guys, that was a long one, but I think it was good. Thanks.